like keeping your promises or not telling lies, a whole variety of different things that one might come up with. And the question therefore arises, so do we regard all of these as self-evident? If not, why not? And how can we say, Sidgwick claims that these axioms are self-evident, how can we claim that just those ones are self-evident rather than some of these other moral rules that a lot of people seem to think are self-evident? Well, I'm not going to be able to give you a full answer to that question, but one thing that I think is relevant and ought to be taken into account is whether some of these ideas can be given an explanation in evolutionary terms that perhaps suggests that although we feel these things, although we have these intuitions, we ought not to give them the sort of idea that they somehow are a sign of what's morally true, because we can explain why we have them in evolutionary terms and in ways that do not necessarily point to the truth of the ideas. So, for example, another view that I'm been defending for many years is the view that we have obligations to distant strangers. In fact, we have quite strong obligations to distant strangers if they are in great need, if they're in extreme poverty, and, for example, their children may die because they get malaria or because they get diarrhea from unsafe drinking water, or they're malnourished, they don't have enough to eat. That we in affluent countries have a strong obligation to help them, even to the point of reducing our own level of comfort, lifestyle, in order to be able to help them more. Now, against that, one argument that you often hear is, well, we have prior obligations to people around us, to our family, to our friends, to our immediate community. A lot of people say, well, charity begins at home, is a common saying in English anyway. So we have these other obligations, and therefore our obligation to those far away from us are at least much weaker. We've got to look after those close to us first. Well, if you think about that reaction and that response, it's pretty obvious why that would have evolved given the kind of social mammal that we and our ancestors have been for millions of years. In other words, we evolved in small, face-to-face communities. Anthropologists tell us that probably we spent most of our evolutionary history in communities of no more than 150 individuals. So in that kind of community, obviously it would make sense for you each to help each other, to support each other. That would help the community to do well. And particularly to support your family, because then you would pass on your genes to your kin. Also to help those who help you, so you're in reciprocal relationships with them. And not to help distant strangers. Not to help distant strangers, firstly because your group, your society may well have been in a hostile relationship to other groups around, but even if that was not the case, generally you couldn't do much to help distant strangers. If you didn't know them, if they weren't part of your face-to-face community, you probably wouldn't have had the resources to help them, you wouldn't have had the knowledge to help them, you wouldn't have been able to travel very far to where they are. So for all these reasons, our sense of an obligation to help others would have been a rather limited one. But now, of course, and just in the last really few decades, we have shifted to a society in which we can help people anywhere in the world. We can know what's happening to them instantly, and we can get help to them very quickly in an emergency. And we can certainly help them in non-emergency situations in a variety of effective ways. So the fact that people say, I just don't feel I have the same obligation to people in sub-Saharan Africa or East Asia or somewhere like that, is in a way simply reporting their evolved responses. But that's not a reason to think that we don't have the same obligation. It's not a reason to reject Sidgwick's principle of universal benevolence. It's rather an explanation that I think debunks, that is, discredits as a source of truth these intuitions that we have. And if that's right, then we ought to be skeptical of many of the intuitions. They might, in most circumstances, be a good guide to how we ought to react, but not necessarily a reliable one, especially not in unusual circumstances. Josh Green is a Harvard psychologist who's examined the way we respond to moral dilemmas in various situations. And he makes the analogy of using two kinds of cameras, or maybe one camera in two different modes. So you're probably familiar with the idea of a point-and-shoot camera, okay? You pull it out, open it up, it has autofocus, adjusts to the light, all you have to do is press the button. Mostly it will take a pretty good photograph. And Green thinks that our everyday moral intuitions are like the point-and-shoot camera. That is, somebody describes a situation to you. Should you push a heavy person off a footbridge to stop a runaway train that otherwise is going to kill 5 people? So your initial reaction is, oh no, I mustn't push a stranger to his death. That would be a terrible thing to do. So no, that would be wrong. Well, it's good to have a reaction like that when somebody suggests that you push a stranger to his death, because, you know, throughout your life that is probably always going to be the wrong thing to do. But if somebody says to you, this is the only way to save the lives of 5 strangers, which is not a situation you're likely ever to encounter, but just imagine that you did, should you still rely on that immediate response that says, no, that's a bad thing to do? Green's argument is that in unusual situations, we don't want to use the point-and-shoot mode, okay? So, imagine you're a serious photographer. You're in an unusual situation. The light's very unusual. You particularly want to get some aspect of the photograph, the mist around the mountaintops, or whatever it is. And you know that the point-and-shoot mode isn't going to do that for you well. So, if you're a serious photographer, you have a camera that has manual override. You switch to manual. Now you calculate, you think for yourself, what setting do I need? What speed, what light exposure, what focus? And then you do it, and you get a better result. So Green's view is, when we're in very unusual circumstances, it may not be a good idea to rely on those moral intuitions, because they may give us the wrong results. That's when we need to switch to manual mode, which means we should stop and think and reflect. And the kind of reflection that Green thinks we then will engage in is one that takes account of the consequences. And therefore perhaps says, well, if this is really the only way to save the lives of 5 strangers, by pushing one off a bridge, that's what you ought to do. So if you want to know more about that, you should look at Green's book, which is called Moral Tribes. Okay, so that's about the foundations of ethics that I'm defending, and why why I think that we ought to be somewhat skeptical about a lot of moral intuitions. So I'll just say a little bit now about the application of some of these views, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. Okay, so firstly, animal ethics. As I said, I think if you think that pain is a bad thing and pleasure is a good thing, there's no justification for limiting that to our own species. I've argued that the idea that pain is bad only when it happens to humans, or even that it's worse when it happens to humans, even if it's just a similar amount of pain, is a mistake that is analogous to the mistakes made by racists and sexists. And that's why I've used the term speciesism to suggest that there is a parallel kind of ism to racism and sexism. Why do I say that they're parallel? I mean, they're not parallel in every respect. I grant that there are differences, that there are bigger differences between us and non-human animals than there are between humans of different races or different sexes. But the similarity is that in each case there is a dominant group, a dominant elite that has power over the others. So the most glaring example with regard to racism would be when Europeans bought or captured Africans and thought that they were entitled to use them as slaves, essentially to buy and sell them, use them as tools of labour. So obviously that was convenient for Europeans, especially those who had gone to hot places where they didn't want to work very hard to grow their crops. Very convenient. So they developed an ideology that supported that. An ideology that said Europeans are superior, various times somewhat different ideologies, maybe one that said the slaves will have a better life because they'll become Christians and that's much better than being a heathen. A whole variety of different ideologies that we now reject. We can see them as just rather weak reasoning to justify the use that the Europeans wanted to make of Africans. Similarly, we can see that in patriarchal ideologies that justify humans in keeping women essentially subordinate to them, not allowing them to make their own choices about the way they wanted to live their life, using them as domestic labour or as objects for sexual satisfaction. We can see also now, not quite so easily as we can in the more distant case of African slavery, but we can see that also as a power group developing an ideology to justify its own convenience. And what I'm arguing is that we ought to start to see the idea in which we have put ourselves above non-human animals in a similar way. And we have justified that, of course, in a variety of different ways as well. Sometimes in religious ways, by talking about God having given us dominion over the animals, or we alone being made in the image of God, or we alone having immortal souls. And sometimes we've done it by exaggerating the differences between us and them. So claiming that we alone are self-aware or rational beings, when it's clear that there is an overlap between our species and non-human species. An overlap in the sense that there are some non-human animals who are more self-aware, more rational than some humans. So chimpanzees or dolphins or elephants are clearly more rational than any of us were when we were 1 month old. And if you then say, yes, but when we were 1 month old we had the potential to become more rational, which would require somewhat more argument, still there are, unfortunately, some humans who lack that potential because of genetic abnormality or because of damage sustained in utero or immediately after birth. They may have such profound brain damage that they will never surpass chimpanzees or elephants or a number of other animals. So there's an overlap. So it's very hard to defend the idea that humans have a superior moral status because they're more rational or more self-aware than non-humans. And so the arguments that some distinguished philosophers used, including Immanuel Kant, who said that we are self-aware, so we are ends in themselves, but animals are only means to our ends because they're not self-aware. That argument, at the very least, if you accept it at all, would mean that some animals are ends in themselves and some humans are merely means to ends, an implication that Kant never discusses. So it's that kind of idea that leads to questions about whether some non-human animals are persons and ought to have a special status because of that. And because when I was a preference utilitarian, that was an important consideration that I used to defend the idea that, in fact, the wrongness of killing depends on having certain kinds of preferences for one's life in the future, for example. I still think that that's relevant to the wrongness of killing, but if you abandon preference utilitarianism and you become, say, a hedonistic utilitarian, thinking that pleasure and pain are the ultimate values, the situation is slightly different. You can still argue that there's a difference in the killing of beings who can anticipate their death, because that's going to spread fear and anxiety and insecurity amongst humans, amongst beings who can have that anticipation. So you can still draw some distinctions there. But the wrongness of killing does seem to depend more on whether it does or does not reduce happiness in the world, create more suffering, rather than on the concept of personhood itself. So my position on that view has changed somewhat and is probably still not entirely settled. I'm actually going in about 2 weeks to speak at a conference in France of the International Society for Utilitarian Studies, where there'll be a panel discussing exactly this question. What sorts of views we ought to have about killing both humans and animals if in fact one is a hedonistic utilitarian. The main point, though, I think, in my views about non-human animals does not depend on the wrongness of killing. It depends on this point about giving equal weight to the suffering of any being who can suffer, equal weight for similar amounts of suffering. Differences in species might lead to some species having different capacities for suffering, and that's relevant. You can take that into account. But you can't just say, because this being is not a member of our species, its suffering counts less. Okay, let me say a little bit about where my views are now on questions about global poverty. And as Professor Heike mentioned in the introduction, I have been in the last few years writing about effective altruism, which is a new emerging movement of people who want to live their lives to some extent in accordance with that axiom of universal benevolence that Sidgwick talked about, although I'm sure most of them have never read Sidgwick, but making the world a better place, making that an important part of their lives. And I think it certainly follows that anyone who is a utilitarian ought to be doing that, ought to be thinking about what am I contributing to making the world a better place. And although utilitarians are not going to expect everyone to be saintly and to make that the goal of everything they do, it still ought to be a significant goal in terms of what they do. So that's, if you like, the altruism part of it. The effective altruism part is something that has more recently been added by a number of young philosophers mostly, people like Toby Ord and Will MacAskill, who are philosophers at Oxford, who have emphasised the importance of using reason and evidence to make sure that insofar as you are acting altruistically, you really find out what will do the most good that you can. And that does relate to what I talked about before about the difference between helping people close to you in your neighbourhood and people far away. Because if you live in an affluent country, it's very likely that you'll be much more effective by helping an organisation that is doing something for people in extreme poverty in the developing world. The reason for that is pretty simple. Given the kinds of systems of social security that you have in the affluent world, given the fact that everybody has safe drinking water, that everybody has the right to send their children to school, that everybody has the right to some basic health care at least. So these needs are taken care of really for people in affluent countries, whereas there are at least 700 million people in the world who don't have these things at all. So you can help them much more effectively, you can do much more good for them by helping them. So there's this whole literature that has now sprung up about how to be an effective altruist, and I won't say more about that at the moment. The final questions that I'm going to mention is I have also worked a lot on questions of bioethics, and in particular questions about, I know it's a taboo word in German perhaps still, but not in English, questions about euthanasia or assistance in dying, where I think the implications of a utilitarian view are pretty clear, at least certainly for voluntary euthanasia, or as it's sometimes called, physician assistance in dying. Because if you're concerned about suffering, if you're concerned about preventing pointless suffering, then if somebody is terminally or incurably ill, and if they judge that their life has more suffering in it than it has anything positive, and physicians agree that that's not going to change, that they're not going to recover or get better, and they therefore ask the physician for assistance in dying, to either they ask the physician to end their life, or they ask the physician to prescribe them something that they can use to end their life, then from the point of view that I've been developing, it's hard to see a reason why that should be prohibited. And it's interesting that in recent years, that's also something that is starting to be increasingly accepted. So over the years that I've been writing about this, which now goes back quite a long way to the 1980s, we've seen a number of jurisdictions in which this has become legal in various ways, initially in the Netherlands, in neighbouring countries of the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg,